All right, welcome everyone to our first Conversations in Agave May Talk. I am Susan Koss with Mezcalistas, and I'm really excited to have Arik Torren of Fidencio Spirit and Clayton Szczech of Experience Agave on tonight to talk about non-DO distillates from the state of Jalisco, which is a really interesting development happening with all sorts of changes in bringing on the Ricea DO, etc. So we're just kind of going to walk through the landscape of the DO and talk about that, and then look at some of the non-DO spirits that we're seeing come into the market now. If you have questions, if there's a burning question pertinent to what's being said right at that time, drop it in the Q&A and I will try and get that answered. Otherwise, just hold off until the end where we will do longer Q&A. So with that said, I'll just let Clayton, you can talk a little bit about just your background, and then Arik, just a couple things about you as well.
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everybody. Happy birthday, Susan. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I started a company now known as Experience Agave about 11 years ago. I'm based in Mexico City, which is where I'm at right now, but it started with a exclusive focus on tequila. So I began my agave adventure in Jalisco, and over the years have started to branch out and learn more about other mezcales of Jalisco and other parts of Mexico. And primarily what I've done is educational tourism for consumers and aficionados, but have sort of started transitioning conveniently enough to more consulting and writing and things like that.
And Arik, I am unmuting you. Hold on. There we go. All right,
can you guys hear me?
Now we can, yes.
I'm Arik Torren, and my company's Fidencio Spirits, which is an import company that I started with this launch and starting of my brand, Fidencio Mezcal, which we launched about a decade ago. My background is in restaurants, so that's how I came into this front of the house for 20 years. A lot of focus on beverage whenever I could, but you know, did all the jobs, you know. And I was very fortunate to have a break in between projects. Not my choice at the time, but I wound up in Oaxaca with that, and I wound up starting my mezcal journey, you know, and I was already a big tequila fan, but, you know, didn't really understand, you know, what's what, you know, and the first step of seeing production answers so many questions. And then the whole thing since then for me is continuing to learn about the people and the flavors and the experiences and connect that to people outside.
And thank goodness. As so much of us who are in mezcal world, it usually every story starts with, well, I went to Oaxaca, and then goes from there. I think, you know, like one of the things in talking about denominación de origen is how they've been developed over the years in Mexico. And when Art Clayton and I were talking last week about this, Arik brought up a really interesting point about the different DOs. And I just, you know, want you to lay it out again in terms of what they kind of look like across the different spirits.
What Susan's referring to is a little bit later in the conversation, we were talking about just, you know, the way that tequila was organized was very much in step with the original wine DO, which is in Bordeaux, the AOC in Bordeaux in 1855, which is really about terroir. So you're taking a place for a product and you're not identifying the source material. It's a wine, it's from Bordeaux, and then you could kind of build it around that, and you have different classifications within that. And had they done that in Mexico, we would have Mezcal de Tequila, Mezcal de Costa de Jalisco, Mezcal de Oaxaca, Central Valles, and on and on and on. And there would be hundreds of appellations of Mezcal. And, but they did the tequila one without doing that, but still in the formula of naming it after a place, the town of Tequila, the epicenter of the production and the history of tequila. And Bacanora is like that as well. When they made the DO of Mezcal, it's really confusing. And I remember trying to make an elevator pitch about what is Mezcal 15 years ago when I'm trying to raise money. And it was hard because it's a product and it's a category. So they named the category after the final product. They took this general term. It's like naming cognac brandy, you know, they really took that and they narrowed the legal definition of it, which was 5 states, now 9 states. And then we have another one in just talking, not in agave anymore, but within Mexico, and how lack of, you know, just how independent each one is of each other. Sotol is made, is named after its source material. So it's named after the plant, not the place and not the product. So there is no set, you know, direction for how they chose to do it as a nation.
So it's led to a little bit of confusion, and you know, some could say how we get to this place of non-DO spirits in Mexico when these different things kind of are all brought together, you know, and like with Raicilla too, it's based on a product name and not actually on a location. So then specific to Jalisco, what does that mean in terms of, you know, you touched on it, that they were looking to build it on kind of the Appalachian model in Europe, but how did that even come about, Arik?
Clayton, you probably know the history more than I do of that, no?
Well,
the tequila history.
Yeah, you know, Arik's absolutely right that this all comes from France, and that, you know, arguably, and the sociologists and the developmental economists that study DOs the most will generally point to France as the most successful DOs if we take as their ultimate goals the preservation and economic well-being of the traditional people that make these traditional products. And to me, it's very interesting, and I kind of went back and revisited over the last week the original declaration in the official gazette of the Mexican government before a DO was declared. DOs, as Arik points out, had already been around in France for about 100 years, but in 1949, the Mexican government declares a tequila region. And it's very, very interesting to look at that as kind of a foundational document for what was the first, you know, declared, any kind of geographical indication declared in Mexico, and what would become the first non-European, the first recognized non-European geographical indication. And GIs are just a more generic term because the French say appellation, and the Mexican we say denominación, and so GIs are the most generic term that covers all of that. And in 1949, they said very, very little about what tequila was, but they said that it was from the state of Jalisco, and it was made from the blue agave and other varietals found in the region. Because at that time, of course, the cloning from hijuelos was not nearly as ubiquitous as it is now. It was still already very common practice. But, you know, as anybody who knows even a little bit about sexual reproduction in agaves knows, those lines become very, very muddied if quiotes are shooting up, and different cultivars are very much able to cross with each other. So there's a recognition of two things that I think are important in that 1949 document, which is that it was some people would say still very large area because it was all of Jalisco from the get-go. But by that time, the highlands in Jalisco had been farming agave and making tequila for 40 to 60 years, whether you're talking about tequila or agave. And the other thing is they didn't have this very, very narrow definition of the source material. And so what you would see within 20 years is both of those things start to change. And I think that's sort of where not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but we start to go down the path that some of us would say is the dilution of denominations of origin in Mexico start to happen almost from the very beginning.
So then in terms of the official rules and the CRT now, what kind of, we're at the point where it outlines tequila to be labeled tequila. It can only be a Tequilino Weber Blue Agave. Like, are there, you want to speak to anything else that's specific?
Yeah, I think in terms of the current day governance of tequila, and then getting from that into Mezcal and Raicilla, and Arik's going to know the details of the way this works in Mezcal far better than I do. But in tequila, one of the things that's interesting and again differs from the French and most of the European models is that you have a state declaration of a region. So the Mexican state owns the rights to the words tequila and Mezcal. But then you have a separate set of regulations, which is the norm that govern production and quality standards for the product. And so you really kind of have two different entities. One is the Mexican state itself that controls the geographical region. And then you have, in the case of tequila, and I believe the CRM would be the same, you have this state authorized but non-state actor that the industry funds and is responsible ultimately for putting that stamp on there and saying, yes, this is tequila, or yes, this is Mezcal. So from the beginning, you kind of have this parallel process where you're defining the region and then you're defining the product, and they don't always completely jibe. So in tequila, you get to where we're under the 2012 norm now. And over the years, the geography was expanded, and most ridiculously, in 1974 and 1976, was expanded to include a small area of Tamaulipas. And if you've got your map out, Tamaulipas is way over on the other side of Mexico on the Gulf Coast, and that was very much just about a commercial and political back scratching arrangement, straight up. And it's funny when you see anyone try to argue for anything else. The CRT will say, well, this part of Tamaulipas had the same soil conditions and elevation and this and that. Well, no, there was one fairly powerful family that wanted to be in the DO, and they got their way, whereas other areas like Zacatecas, which I think we're going to get into, that literally border the municipality of Tequila, didn't get in. And maybe they shouldn't have, but they're certainly, they're contiguous with the town itself, the municipality itself. And they also arguably do have a history of this same agave and this same distillation tradition. And then the other piece of it, I would say, to sort of wrap it up, is you, within 30 years, have the standard not only narrowing to one cultivar of agave, but then also saying in the same breath, oh, but actually half of your sugar can be non-agave sugar. So mixto comes in the 60s and was originally 70-30, and over time that's been diluted down to where we are today at 51-49.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I've certainly been fascinated by that struggle that you see in Mezcal world between the CRM and the INPI, which is the overseas, like who gets to claim the use of the words. And so, you'll have different states that will put in to be included into a DO. And the EP might say, okay, yes. And then the governing body is like, nope, you can't do that. And it comes to this interesting struggle. And so within tequila, like kind of with a state like Zacatecas. So what does that mean for them in terms of the production? The product tastes more like a tequila, and yet it's a mezcal.
Big identity crisis, that's for sure.
Wow. So yeah. So where does that leave, some of the states like in this no man's land of in between? So they might never get recognized by the CRM as being legitimate producers of mezcal, and they might never get recognized by the CRT as being legitimate producers of tequila. So what are we to make of that? And
listen to the evangelicals talking about great producers in great places, bringing out non-DO spirits, Distillate de Agave, and acknowledging the unfortunate reality is that these people who, for many, many, many generations, for all the generations, have referred to what they are making what they have made prior to state borders and prior to federal governments and state governments calling it mezcal. So that's like, we have to, as marketeers, navigate and, you know, create ways of talking about something that's amazing. You know, in the case of La Venenosa, when we came out, we called it the local name. This mezcal is a raicilla, you know, and we started talking about raicilla, but from the perspective of the U.S. government and all the other bodies, this is, you know, Distillado de Agave. Raicilla is a cultural name then, up until just recently.
So it's an interesting thing that happens between the Mexican market and the US market, where it seems like there's a greater, I don't want to say understanding, but acceptance of something like a Destilado de Agave, a name on a bottle here, than there is in Mexico, you know. And so what does that tension kind of look like in a place, you know, like Jalisco or Mexico City?
Well, I think that you have a situation right now where the mezcal boom, in terms of not necessarily people like us or our friends on either side of the border, but for sort of more of a mass market. In Mexico, the mass market for mezcal is a couple years or maybe 5 years behind that in the US, in my opinion. And so you've had sommeliers and waiters and bartenders at non-agave specific places in Mexico City and Guadalajara have to work very hard to get fresas, you know, people with a lot of money who 15 years ago would have said, oh no, the mezcal is for the garden, or we don't drink that. These industry professionals, these hospitality professionals, have had to work very hard to get, you know, folks with means to take it seriously. And a big part of how they've done that is by relying on the denominations of origin and saying like, oh, well, you know, cognac, you know, scotch, you know, American whiskeys, mezcal and tequila are at the same level. And yeah, and one of the things that came up in the conversation the three of us had a while ago is, in my personal case, you know, it's not been that many years since I was still just banging that drum as hard as anybody else of like, hey, DO certification. You know, I think it's a very attractive idea, and the ideals of it are very worthwhile. And in the context where it works, it's fantastic. But I think what we're seeing with these particular DOs in Mexico is that, again, if the goal is to preserve tradition and to increase the economic well-being of traditional producers, that's not always what we're seeing, certainly not in the case of tequila. And I think there's always winners and losers, and anybody who's doing well within the DOs, I certainly don't begrudge them that. I mean, they're, you know, of course, fantastic certified tequilas, certified mezcals. There will be fantastic certified raicillas, but I would argue that those are almost in spite of the way that these DOs and their regulatory authorities are set up. And so in the case of the cities in Mexico, I think now it will be a hard turn to say, well, this is like a mezcal, but it's not certified, but it's okay. It's not like the tonalla that you see, you know, the guys on the street buying from the Oxxo, because you have tonalla is an interesting case in Jalisco, where if you've ever, you know, looked at the liquor shelf at a convenience store here, there are these little half-liter or 375 beehive plastic bottles of tonalla. And Tonalla is a village in central South Jalisco that is very, very close to what many people would claim to be the origins of distillation in all of Mexico. And at one time, there was a tradition of vino or mezcal from Tonalla that, you know, was before my time, but I assume it was as good as anything else. And because of the influence of the cane industry and a lot of other factors, this is now like bum juice par excellence. And so that's sort of what a lot of people, especially in Jalisco, think of if they're not from these communities, when you say, well, this is like mezcal, but not quite, or like there's, you know, non-tequila brands that try very hard to look like, I'll just say it, there's a brand called Rancho Alegre that you can buy like at Costco a 5 liter, and maybe it's good, but that's not the types of products that people, you know, generally want their brands to be associated with. So I think because of the type of work that Arik and his brands and many other brands and Susan and Max at Mezcalistas have done for over a decade, I think the American consumer, especially the type that are on this call, listening to this and participating in this, are much more open-minded to now say, oh, okay, well, I know Arik, he has fantastic mezcals. Oh no, this one's going to be not certified. Or, you know, I know Heavy Metal, he has great mezcals. Oh no, this is a non-certified tequila style. Okay, whatever. Like, and it's really based more around these relationships than the institutional seal.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add on top of that, one of the things that I think is also different about the United States market versus Mexico. In Mexico, you have beautiful high-end restaurants with really amazing sommeliers going around hand selling and doing that. But what we have a lot more, maybe more than the rest of the planet probably, to some, is, sorry about that. Is corner restaurants, neighborhood bistros with incredibly knowledgeable, passionate people that I get to, you know, they liaison, that they then take the enthusiasm and the inspiration of what we're pass on to them, and then they're bring it out. So we have so much more of a culture of that here, and that culture is not that old. You know, it's 20 years at max. So we're really fortunate. The timing of everything is definitely supported by that as well. The people out there that I always say that anybody who winds up buying one of these unusual things from my book or anybody else, they're only buying it because they're choosing to be a brand ambassador for us. And it's amazing, you know, so we have that part of our fabric.
Well, I will say on the Mezcalistas end, like editorially speaking, one of the challenges for us has been you know, we call it mezcal, and it's differentiating between the capital M and the lowercase m and how we use it. And it's very frustrating, like making our way through that. And certainly we've had interactions with, you know, the CRM about the use of some of our terminology, and just trying to say, we are trying to keep it cultural in the use of the word mezcal. And then when it's specific to a certified product, we will use a capital M to kind of make it official that way. But I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that's fascinating to me is, like you had mentioned, William, earlier, and also Arik with you, specific to the case of La Venenosa, you were the first Raicilla in the market. And so you had to create like a market for Raicilla, to talk about it as Raicilla, to explain the place from where it is from, like all of that. And now you're changing this year, because you're going to be stepping back from the capital R Raicilla and into the lowercase r Raicilla or Distillates.
Yes. Susan, at some point I want to hear more about how the CRM tried to put pressure on your editorial body of using the word mezcal. I hope you don't pay them any dues. No. But yeah, so Raicilla became a denomination of origin in 2019. And it was already tracking in the wrong direction for some time before that. But when this all started, when I met Esteban, the owner, founder of La Venenosa, and one of the earliest evangelical of mezcal from Jalisco, from Raicilla, we talked about, like, so the DO, it's amazing. The DO can be this way. We could do it all together. Everything should be done right. We don't have to cut and paste and be a cookie cutter and wedge in and make you know, the wrong accommodations. We see the mistakes of Mezcal, and because Mezcal was a copy and paste with modifications, and since of the tequila dio, and not a figurative copy and paste, it was a copy and paste with some changes. And then what led to challenges in the Mezcal dio because of that, you know, like acid issues and other classification issues, and many changes that have happened over the years. So it was really obvious, like, what to do. Don't do that. Start up, you know, from the bottom and just build it. And it didn't go that way. The power shifted of the voices and the backing, the financial backing. So it just became something that Esteban decided to not fight, and realized that, you know, fortunately, over time, he, with my help and other people's help in other countries and everywhere, built a brand. So now that brand can operate without making choices and still be a brand, and it's going to continue on. So La Venenosa is going to go forward, and Espíritu de Jalisco, the spirit of Jalisco, and not carry the flag of Raicilla in terms of the label, but always talk about it as Raicilla because it is a Raicilla, you know. So when we talk about it, when we share it, and when we talk about, folks out there might be, you know, in restaurants or dealing with menus and how to classify it, if we take the word Raicilla off the label and you categorize it under Raicilla, we encourage you to do that. And it is Raicilla, and we don't have an issue with that. So it's not about rejecting all concepts of Raicilla. It's really about not participating in a narrow body of Raicilla, you know, official narrow body of Raicilla. So that's what's going to happen. A little bit of extra work on everybody, but, you know, the brand started with work is ridiculous. bringing them like this, I'm like, okay, let's shift from Mezcal to Raicilla. Trust me. It was definitely zero when we started.
It definitely was. I remember, I think it was 2015, with La Venenosa participating in Mexico in a Bottle, and that was the first time a Raicilla had been there. But I mean, Clayton, like, how does this carry over into, you know, the world of tequila when you've got products that, you know, are so traditionally tequila, and yet they're for whatever reason, either by choice or by some part of the rules, they are not a tequila?
Well, I think Jalisco is super interesting as a venue for this discussion in general, because it's quite possibly, you know, Southern Jalisco, Northern Colima. I saw somebody have a question about Colima on the chat. We'll probably get to that later, but arguably, and not going to go into like fighting about pre-Hispanic distillation, I hope, but you know, it's to my mind very probable that Southern Jalisco is where distillation started in Mexico one way or another. And then you have the oldest Mexican dio in tequila. You have the newest Mexican dio in Raicilla, and you have possibly the oldest distillation tradition in the country that is Mezcal, that we all know will probably never be admitted as Mezcal because it's Jalisco, and because, you know, tequila is king here. And even if, you know, Aguascalientes wins, and even if we get all these, I agree with Arik, I would love to see, you know, kind of AVA style micro denominations throughout Mexico for Mezcal. In the fantasy world where that happens, I think Jalisco would be the last place because of the economic and political situation there. But so you have these three kind of different types of agave spirits, and when you have some of the most historical and authentic distilling traditions in Mezcal that will probably never be called Mezcal legally, you have, just to take one example, Caballito Cerrero, which is a blue agave distillate in the tequila tradition. The ancestors of the Jimenez family who make it now were making it there in the same place in 1873 in a pretty similar way. They predate the denomination of origin. They predate the CRT. They predate the modern Mexican federal government, and they have always opted not to certify themselves as tequila, kind of flirted with it, and then for various reasons decided not to. And then when you have a brand like La Venenosa and all the producers behind them, and as everybody's already acknowledged, like they created the category in the United States, and they have very traditional producers are, for valid reasons, taking Raicilla in their own direction, or in its own direction, the real direction. Those three things are themselves kind of pretty serious indictments of these three denominations of origin and the way that they're currently constructed and run. And I'm not, I think apparently I'm still not allowed to say the name, but in addition to all the great non-certified traditional mezcals, like the presentation you and I saw the other night, Susan, of Neta and Cinco Sentidos, there's a very, very big name in traditional ancestral mezcal that's very soon going to be outside of the CRM system. And so I think in all three of these, if you have some of the most traditional and legacy producers that either are excluded de facto or opt out of these systems, that tells me that these systems are not doing what they're supposedly set up to do.
That's Arik, would you agree on that level?
Oh, wholeheartedly. Yeah, I mean, it was things that popped into my head as you were talking. I'm told that the same lawyer who was sort of responsible for the final writing of the Tequila DO is the same lawyer for the Mezcal DO and the Raicilla DO. So there's a lot of push on there from just like ego perspective to get it kind of like, through, people who know how to do things government wise. But yeah, there's a lot to indict the DO for sure, for all the DOs. The real sad thing in a lot of ways is that had it been done from, an inclusive and holistic perspective, you really have the opportunity as the DO functioning and and thriving as the marketing arm of all these individual people to the world. Because now it's set up as kind of a competitive market between each other. And it's like tequila has clearly been first out the gate and really dominant. And it becomes a big business pressure.
Wow.
And how it's evolved.
Well, I mean, which was why it was interesting to me. There was that recent Bloomberg article. And I know that you were quoted in it as it was talking about, move over, was basically like tequila and mezcal are dead. And now it's about these other things. And it's, and I think for me, that goes to the heart of the problem of all of these different DOs, because it's like, they're all agave distillates. It's not like one is replacing the other. The market is expanding, and we are embracing different types of distillation styles, of flavors of agave. So it was an interesting article to read.
And it brings up another sort of systemic issue. As soon as that came out, Brad, the writer, sends me a text. He's like, "I'm sorry about the title. That was the editor." Okay. So so that compounds on everything, on how things get broadcasted into the universe. Yeah, I'm like, oh, and I hadn't seen the title yet, so I didn't have a chance to be, pushed by it. And I'm like, yeah, that's a shitty title, and that's not what he meant.
No,
but it's what sells.
I will say, as somebody who has a blog and like trying to figure out like headlines and all of that, that was definitely a perfect clickbait article, because it was just like, hell yeah, I want to read that. Like, I am totally like going there. So, you know, I get it from the media side. But writers very rarely have any say in what the headline is on the article. But the article was great.
Right.
And if
It
anyone
was,
out
yeah.
there in the audience who hasn't had a chance to read it, it was from Bloomberg, and it came out. We definitely posted it on the Facebook page for Mezcalistas, but it is a good read. But like, okay, so back to Jalisco, because Clayton, you've recently been involved in a project that, you know, falls outside of any possible DO recognition. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Some people listening might be aware I did a blog post about this and some social media stuff, but over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, got to know a little bit traditional tequilero, tabernero named Alfredo Rios Landeros, and he and his brother had come into our bar, La Cata, a couple of times. And they live in, if you don't know, municipalities in Mexico are basically what we would call counties in the US. And the municipality of Tequila is really big. I don't know how many hectares it is, but it borders the state of Nayarit and it borders the state of Zacatecas. Part of that is just where it lies, but it's big enough that it borders 2 other states that it's not in. And he lives in a little ranch called Atemanica, which back when this was a mining area in the 16th century was essentially the county seat. Now it's really a pretty inaccessible, not particularly welcoming kind of little hole in the wall. But there are still people up there, and one of the things actually that really captured my imagination when I first started going to Raicilla tabernas was you see the common roots of all Jaliscan mezcal, because in their vocabulary and in many of their processes too, the traditional Raicilla producers, it's almost like going back in time to tequila of 200 years ago. You know, not to say that the regions don't have their own distinct traditions, they certainly have their own agaves, but words like taberna and things like that, it really captured my imagination that Raicilla still used all this terminology. And this is still very much the case in the Sierra of Tequila, where the fact that there's a CRT and certification is really something that's essentially passed them by. And people live not in dire poverty for Mexico. They tend to have little ranches and they tend to have their farms and some horses and things like that. But you have a situation where people who can trace, you know, with documentation, their family back 4 or 5 generations, even using the same stills, and they have stories of being persecuted in the second half of the 20th century by federal police for distilling and this and that. And these people are in many ways really the guardians of tequila culture and of tequila history. And, you know, I don't want to say that they are necessarily actively excluded, but you would think that in 1974, when the DO was created, and in 1994 when the CRT was created, that again, if the goal is in fact the preservation of traditional production and culture and the economic well-being of those producers, that the first thing they would have done would be to go up to these hills and say, hey guys, what can we do to help you find these markets? What can we do? And of course that was never done. In fact, they were still being persecuted in the 90s. So again, it's just one example. There's examples in Raicilla, there's examples in Mezcal, but as someone who's been focused more than any other spirit on tequila for a little over 10 years, it's really been an awakening to me and changed a lot of my perspectives in the last 3 years of getting to know Alfredo and his community, that this is tequila, you know, and just as most of us would probably most or all of us would probably easily agree, that you can't go in and tell people who have made mezcal for generations that suddenly it's not mezcal or it's not Raicilla. Like the same goes for tequila. And you know, a lot of people have heard me bang this drum before, but I'm very much against throwing the baby out with the bathwater with tequila, in terms of, oh, it's all this, it's all that. Well, I think with tequila, it's always important to define your terms. Are you talking about most tequila by volume, or are you talking about most tequila by producers? Because most tequila by volume comes out of a small handful of places, but most tequila producers are medium, small, and micro producers. And yes, they're going to be using steam. They're going to be using a lot more stainless steel than most mezcal. And that also grows out of the industrial tradition of Jalisco and what was Nueva Galicia. But anyway, to me, the fact that there are people in the municipality of Tequila who have maintained these traditions that could easily have been done 100 or 120 years ago, and have never been asked, have never been reached out to. And certainly, and if you see pictures of this process, there would be things that the CRT would immediately say, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. And so quite, rather than preserving these traditional cultures of production, they're actually excluding them and even contributing to erasing them.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I think will be interesting is, especially as more of these non-DO spirits come into the market, that they are accepted into the U.S. market. How will the CRT or other forces kind of respond to that? And will there be pushback on having non-DO spirits in the market from certifying bodies? I mean, you definitely see pushback on that with the CRM in handling destillados. So what do you sense might happen? Arik, I'll start with you in terms of pushback about not using Raicilla or not joining, the certifying with this Raicilla.
I have no idea. And to be honest with you, I'm not familiar with some of the pushback that you might be referring to through the non-certified Mezcal DO products. I'd love to know more about that. What's different about Mezcal tequila versus Bacanora, Sotol, Raicilla is the way and the level in which the DO is woven into the federal laws. So, as well as international laws and the international recognition. So, I think on the real answer to your question is we could tell by Sotol and Raicilla that there's zero enforcement, Sotol and Bacanora, that there is no enforcement. There has not been enough progress by the organizations, the governing bodies, to convert that into the same type of circumstances tequila and DO. So it really becomes just the principles of the people involved. I work with Roberto Contreras in Rancho Tapua, Bacanora, and he's distilling some palmilla, some sotol. He's distilling other different species of agave. We're going to bring that someday into the U.S. and easily we could get that into the U.S. approved by the American government with the word Bacanora on there. He's going to choose not to. We are going to choose not to respect the DO, but there is no bite, so far. And Raicilla is 19 years younger. So that's 20 years it's been like that. Might progress differently, but I don't see that being, it's really just about what, sort of the brand choice at this time.
And Clayton, do you see any sort of pushback toward the Caballito?
Not real.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, if the CRT couldn't stop them from selling it with tequila on the label until a couple of years ago, and part of that was just because they had mostly sold to people they knew and in their cantina in Guadalajara. But any importer, any brand, I mean, we've all got a lawyer, right? I mean, I don't think anyone who's actually investing money into this and actually serious about this is going to break the actual rules. I mean, these products are going to come in without the, as you call them, the capital T, capital R, capital M words on them. And then, you're in your marketing materials, as far as I know, you can refer to those things. And, obviously in your hand selling and in your educational presentations, you are going to call it Raicilla, you are going to call it tequila, you are going to call it mezcal because historically and traditionally that's what it is. I think, not to throw the CRT under the bus entirely, because I think the CRT in many ways is a very, very functional organization. I think most of the problems are baked into the system. And if the CRT is not prohibiting the mezquilas and vodquilas and whiskilas that I could, go buy in a liquor store in Guadalajara right now, then it's hard for me to imagine they're going to actually go after, somebody who's actually bringing a product legitimately into the U.S. Where I think you'll see interesting reactions in all three of these categories is from producers themselves, maybe especially in tequila, where it's currently basically unheard of that you're going to have success as a destilado, right? Whereas in mezcal, there's already some examples of people, on a very small scale doing a good job and having some success, and the same I'm sure will be the story with Venenosa, but in tequila we haven't had that, and now that Caballito is in the U.S., I would imagine there's going to be a lot of small producers struggling with high agave prices who are going to look at that and say, hey, wow, they're like, because they can do the math as well as any of us and say, well, if it's selling for X a bottle in New York, then the producer is going to be getting about N per liter here. Hey, that's pretty good. And that might cause some people to jump the gun, because they might not every tequila producer will necessarily understand the work that's gone into to building that groundwork. But I think we probably will see a increased leakage out of the DO. I mean, it's definitely a theory that I'm promoting.
Clayton, do you think that there is I've heard of where some of the powerful brands in tequila are interested in considering other agave types within tequila certification?
I'm not aware of that. If they are, it's definitely not something that's, yeah.
Don't want to see that.
Something that's not.
That's like my biggest fear since day one. Like, because they could turn it off. If they could ruin everything if they just, change that one rule.
It's really so weird, and I agree with you. I wouldn't want to see it happen at this point. But it's always been so weird that you're gonna have this allowance for mixto in tequila, and you're explicitly going to say 49% could be any sugar, but not another agave. Ooh, gross.
Right.
Agaves. Let's get some high fructose corn syrup up in here.
Well, I mean, I know I've been to a few of the Maestros de Mezcal encuentros, and it's been interesting to me to see how they have grown, and with the different producers coming from all over Mexico. And each year there have been a few more people from Jalisco participating in it. So it's like you can see some people testing the waters potentially, or maybe looking to want to get in front of potential importers or brands, bringing on, something to the portfolio. But it is, I wonder at what points, as we're seeing more destilados come into the market, does the Mexican government say, whoa, wait a minute, we have this whole category that's getting exported, and it basically is not fully regulated outside of the NOM 199, which is the overall alcohol rules, if I'm understanding it correctly. And that dictates the ethanol levels, et cetera.
And the ABVs.
So, I mean, do you see the potential risk as, as people look to that, to work, when I say work around a DO, I don't mean in a negative way. Oh,
this is a big reason why we're dropping the word raicilla.
Oh.
We don't want to drop the 63%, the puntas, it's like, it's too joyful.
Yeah. But again, like, as people, I'll say, working around EOs, not in a negative way, but because it does not really relate to the product that people are producing. And so therefore they're choosing to go in this direction. But does that run the risk of somebody just being like, whoa, we have to put an end to this? And then what happens?
I'm not sure if I follow you, like, if running the risk of someone putting the end to, like, distillados being made coming through.
Yeah, just like as, because it exists in this territory that's not governed by any particular regulatory body aside from the overarching NOM 199. And for those of you in the audience, the NOM 199 is the overall alcohol laws that apply to all spirits in Mexico, in terms of the parameters of what's allowed with ethanol, methanol, like all of the different organic components, etc.
My best answer is that I have faith. And the reason why I have faith is that I look at the history of Mexico in comparison to the history of the United States as both being this new world, new settlement kind of places. And there's a much greater tradition of allowing and not stifling the traditional and endemic people's practices. I used to say it like basically like, in the United States, we were giving out smallpox blankets. They weren't really doing that in Mexico. You go to Oaxaca and you can find people speaking 11 of the 17 pre-Hispanic languages, or maybe more. So there isn't a complete annihilation of its own history. So for that reason, I have faith that hope that it won't happen.
Clayton, thoughts?
I think that, I have no idea. It's an interesting time in Mexico. We're only 2 years into the 6-year presidency. We're obviously dealing with the same pandemic that everybody else is. But my experience, I'm not a exporter or distributor or anything like that, but my experience for a short time having a bar here is that if you pay all your taxes, that goes a long way. And again, getting back to is the CRT going to get up in arms? Is the state going to get up in arms? If and everybody that we know is doing things by the book, and if you're doing things by the book, and if you're paying the tax man, then I think it's much less likely that anything's going to happen, because at the end of the day, they're getting their cut. And that sort of leads to a whole other thing with the YEPs, with the special tax on alcohol and tobacco and soft drinks here, which there's talk of raising even more from the 53%. But a big part of the reason that the U.S. is lucky to get, at this point, in tequila for sure, a greater diversity of products and a greater diversity of quality products than Mexico does, is because, and I am not up on what's happening with the successor to NAFTA. So if I'm wrong, I apologize. But at least, until anything changes there, this stuff all leaves duty free. And in Mexico, it's going to get slapped with 53% YEPs and then 16% value added tax. So the tax situation, I think, is really paramount. And as long as you're paying the right taxes, the government moves very slow. And businesses and brands and these things, I think, move much faster. And so I don't really see it as a big issue personally.
Okay.
That brings up a really good point, and it seems to be, just from the examples out there, and most people who are doing actual brands with trademarks that are not certified are more comfortable, including my own, exporting. As opposed to, avoiding the tax person and just selling in bulk or granel or type of thing, which is a huge, beautiful culture within Mexico, but yeah, those taxes are intense. And not only the taxes, but the documentation for transactions are intense, so yeah. The factura. So therefore, it's just what I guess what we could add into that is we're definitely going to see it continue to thrive in export for not just the cultural reasons of how people drink in Mexico. Sorry. Yeah.
No, totally. I totally agree. Facturación is intense, and I would just add on to that. It's maybe a kind of a side note, but when they were having the forums about the NOM 186 proposal, right? When they wanted to monopolize the word agave, and then when they wanted to revamp 199 so that destilados would have to be called comil, and all these really aggressive actions that certain parties in Mexico have taken against traditional agave spirits producers. Over and over and over again, a thing that you would hear in these forums, and I heard it, I think, from Jason on the Sacred talk the other night. One of those guys said what I hear producers saying all the time: we're not against being regulated, right? We're not afraid to be regulated. And I don't want to speak for anyone in particular, but I've heard probably hundreds of producers say, I want this to be safe. Yeah, I want to be in compliance with health and safety laws. But you can't regulate me out of existence. And I think it's maybe not necessary in this venue. I think we probably have like some very sophisticated, people participating here. I mean, the 50 or whatever, 40 people that are listening. But I think for a general audience, it's really important, for me to remember, at least, to tell people that, like, this is not about wanting to never have a lab test or never be regulated in any sense.
Yeah. And to add into that, just the bureaucratic obstacle as well. It's not just the regulatory, but also just the, fill out these forms in circular, accomplish of nothing. So I agree with what you're saying, and it's rough.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get closer to opening it up to questions from the audience, but back to that one question, what about Colima? To me, it is a very interesting and somewhat ironic thing that, the archaeological study that's out there that is still under review about the potential of pre-Columbian distillation happening in Mexico, that it is based in Colima, and this is just on the other side of the volcano. And yet Colima is one of those cases of just where does that distillation, fall, and it has no choice but to, come out anything from there as a destilado de agave, even though it maybe down the line it will be pointed that is the original mezcal, and it will never be a mezcal, it will never be a tequila, it is not a raicilla. And it is just it's one of those ironies that exist out there for me. So,
well, and I think it gets to one of Arik's original points, that these state boundaries are really much newer than distillation in Mexico. I mean, the modern Mexican state doesn't start until 1921, and the 32 states that exist now weren't the same then. I don't know much about the modern history of Colima. I don't know when Colima was formed, but it's probably not any older than 1921, right? And I just saw a news source I had never seen talking about written documentation of vino mezcal in Colima from 1616. So, the more, so, and again, not to get into the pre-Hispanic thesis, if that was happening, obviously it was happening long before, but that's a 300-year jump on the Mexican government. And I think, similarly to the north of Jalisco, where Arik said something really interesting. I think it was about a tepehuano that you guys were looking at, where you have that finger district up where Jalisco and Durango and Zacatecas, and you said, well, we're not even exactly sure where we are, right? And the people who have lived there forever probably don't necessarily know what state they're in either, because it's kind of irrelevant, right? The natural geography and the cultural geography are much more fundamental. And so, when we were going out to buy blue agave to make this destilado with Alfredo and tequila, I certainly didn't notice when we crossed into Zacatecas. It wasn't nothing. There wasn't even a sign.
Yeah.
I think a great example of that, the example that got me thinking early on was before Puebla was in the DO, and had traveled with a friend who's from there into the Mixteca, into Tehuacan, you're culturally the same. Like, that is the Mixteca district, the Mixteca people. And on one side of the border, it was illegal for them to market and label their product of the same people, of the same geography and the same genetics and the land and everything and culture. And so it was so glaringly wrong, you know. So it was really nice when that changed and obvious. And I think another nice example in Jalisco is the Jalmich, which is the region where the La Venenosa Sierra del Tigre comes from, and it crossed the people there. They use the term internally Jalmich because they culturally identify with each other on both sides of the border, probably more than beyond into their own states.
Yeah. Well, as Christy Martins just pointed out, there are other archaeological studies that are happening around agave distillates. This one in Tlaxaca. Sorry, my pronunciation, and plus I'm on my third mezcal. In in central Mexico, and then also
Susan, you have to drink pulque to say Tlaxcala.
That is true.
I have to go
If
to Tlaxcala to get
if only. But you know, and that there's other research being done in Oaxaca. You know, just to that point of that rich context and history of agave distillation, you know, happening in places where culturally people are similar despite state borders, that have come into play in, you know, in modern Mexico, we'll say. And, you know, and the other point was, I know that there's, you know, the semi-new agave distillate from Colima in the US market now called Dos Volcanos. And that's a project that Craig Reynolds has been working on. And he's also somebody who's been working on the California agave distillate project as well. You know, so there are a lot of interesting pieces here. But before you know, oh, sorry, go ahead, Clayton.
Sorry, I did see. Someone mentioned Dos Volcanes. I'm just a little curious, not to go down a rabbit hole, but I know the first batch that Craig did, he grew the blue agave in Colima, but it was produced in the tequila Dio, actually at a tequila distillery, although obviously not a tequila. I'm curious if that's still the case, and someone can message me off air or whatever. But I think that's a very interesting example, you know, and I'm glad it came up because I wasn't thinking about it. But to your question of, you know, is someone going to step in and squash this? Well, I mean, you know, Craig's paying his, you know, his taxes. He's doing his paperwork. He's selling it as an agave distillate, and you know, I'm sure he uses the M word and the T word as references when he talks about it and sells it, as he should. You know, because it has reference points to both. But and this might be far more controversial. I have plenty of friends down here who are not a big fan of that kind of stuff, but I think it's a great project, and especially because of all the community support he does down in Colima. But I mean, that's a really great example of something very, very hybrid, and you know, maybe we'll be seeing more things like that.
And then there was a clarification question about Nayarit and where it falls into the DO, and Nayarit falls into the Raicilla DO. No. See, this is why I asked. Okay.
Nayarit,
well,
is in the tequila DO, and then they put, Clayton, you know, probably might know this, but inside the Raicilla DO, they put one little portion of Nayarit, but primarily,
that's right.
Historically, it has been part of the tequila DO. I'm glad you circled around to that question. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Arik. It's the southern part of Nayarit. Jalisco is the only state that in its entirety is in the tequila DO. Right. And then there are particular municipalities of the three states that border Jalisco: Guanajuato, Michoacan, and Nayarit, Tamaulipas. We already talked about it's nonsense. But it's the southern part of Nayarit that borders Jalisco. To date, there's not a tequila distillery there. It's all just for agave production. You're absolutely right, Arik, and we didn't get much into the current version of the Raicilla norm, which they're still writing the norm. They haven't formed the regulatory body yet. But Valle de Banderas is the one municipality that they included in Nayarit, which if you've been to Vallarta is basically like Nuevo Vallarta in north. It's like the airport in north.
And it's my understanding there's nobody distilling there.
There's not,
historical evidence
and
of
you know,
distillation
as you can
happening.
imagine, it's yeah. And sorry, I've got kind of a delay. Sorry if I cut you off.
No, it's fine.
Go ahead, you're good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of many things that worry me about the way that the DO was written. The argument for it, and it's not completely without basis, but the argument for it is that they used to take in boats and canoes a bunch of raicilla from Yalapa that came out from Cabo Corrientes, and they would sail or row up to Valle de Banderas and sell it there, because San Blas, it was the big port at the time, and that's where all the tequila went to as well on the railroad. So it's like, okay, there's a story there, but you know, you have all this open area out there where someone could come in and build a real big factory real close to Puerto Vallarta, and it makes me hella nervous.
But it hasn't happened with tequila yet, and that I'm glad. The reason why I'm glad somebody brought up Ed Taylor brought up the Nayarit question is that it's always been a good example of the politics of a DO for me. Another example in that that was added to the DO. There's never been a tequila distillery there, and it's just clearly backstop. I would imagine it where that somebody who was involved in writing the DO had a couple of thousand hectares in that area and might have wanted to give himself a future opportunity. In glaring contrast to southern Zacatecas, that is endemic genetics for Blue Weber, has people farming for generations and generations of Blue Weber and distilling a lot of tequila style agave spirit, and would have been a big competitor to the distilleries in Jalisco, and were forced out. So they took the consolation prize of being a part of the Mezcal DO. And there's clearly a lot wrong with that, because when you go through Zacatecas, the majority of what you have options of being made is really damn good lowercase tequila. You know?
And I totally agree, and I would say that's arguably the case with you know, Guanajuato has a foot in the tequila DO and a foot in the mezcal DO, but I certainly don't know everything about mezcal from Guanajuato, but it's arguably also more in the tequila tradition than it is, say, in a mezcal tradition along the lines of Michoacan or Guerrero or something like that. Maybe even San Luis, even though they have Salmiana. But in terms of the hacienda history, you know, it's interesting, because you're certainly right that it has more in common with that.
But there is a commonality to San Luis Potosí and Guanajuato as well. A lot of Salmiana there, but I mean, I think if you are going to make a plant a flag on which is more culturally connected to, it seems like it would be tequila.
For sure.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yep. All right. I think on that note, let's open it up to some Q&A. Actually, I see Edward followed up a little bit, and he said he's been told by people who should know that the majority of agave processed by Locofredia comes from Nayarit. I assume that makes no sense.
No difference.
Or no difference, sorry.
No difference.
All right.
La Cofradia is a big tequila distillery. Edward, hi, Edward. I know that at least until they were bought, Casa Noble got all their agave from Nayarit. I'm not meaning to cast aspersions. I just know less about them since they got bought by CBI. I assume Cofradia is getting agave from wherever they can afford to get it right now, like pretty much everybody else in the valley. But the Nayarit connection might be more about Casa Noble, because I know that Cofradia has definitely got a lot of agave from Jalisco as well.
Other questions from people, and I've put my reading glasses on now, which will help me see the small print on my computer screen. So from Michael Hurley, what about the Sinaloa proposal for Mezcal Dio? That is La Triguilla territory, not Mezcal with big M. Any feelings or thoughts on that regarding Sinaloa?
I'd love a bottle if anybody's got some. What you got? Yeah, I mean, it's Lechuguilla down there, but it's also Lechuguilla on the very opposite side in the far north, right below Arizona. So outside the Dio of Bacanora, above is also a lot of terminology for Lechuguilla as a category, like Mezcal is or like Bacanora is. I know there's a lot of agave down there, and I'd be really interested to try it. And if anybody's looking for an importer.
Well, and Sinaloa certainly has a very, very long history of distillation as well, you know, and I think, like, I'm 100% in agreement that in a real GI system, we'd have innumerable dozens, scores, hundreds of these regions, and you know, Sinaloa goes back to the 17th century for distillation for sure. I'm also not familiar with it personally, but I know it from books.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, in Lechuguilla, it seems to be, you know, with Michael Hurley chiming in, that it is one of those agaves that does not recognize an international border and actually exists in New Mexico as well. So getting into the crazy border conversation there about distillates. There is a question about, you know, there being an older reputation around Raicilla being hallucinogenic. Was that just a marketing tool? I haven't.
I would say it's definitely hallucinogenic if you eat it with some mushrooms, for sure. That's a fact. If you are trying to just see God through the alcohol, there is a lot of argument. I don't know if it's an argument, but there is perspective of individuals who take the consumption of alcohol beyond intoxication into, you know, extreme intoxication to have outer body experiences. And there is a practice throughout the world for that, but I don't think it's anything that we would categorize as a hallucinogenic.
Clayton, any thoughts on that? No. No further thoughts on that. What other questions do we have from the audience here? Anything? I mean, this has been a pretty complete explanation. I will just say I had the pleasure a couple of weeks ago of doing my first virtual online tasting, and Arik and Esteban were leading that talk, and I learned so much about Bacanora. And despite having Mexico in a bottle, despite, you know, writing and doing these things, I so rarely actually have the time to be able to try the product and have these, you know, great conversations one-on-one with people. And that was such a great talk. And thank you for that much information.
I think the whole virtual online connecting and talking and tasting has been really, I think it's going to be a permanent outcome of the times that we're in, because it's nice that we're doing this. It's nice to see your faces and hear you talk.
No, I mean, I agree. And I, you know, definitely with the conversations, and it's far less expensive.
It's cheap. Well, sorry.
And I, you know, we have definitely have set up the Conversations in Agave platform to be a permanent fixture with the different types of programming that we're going to do.
Nice.
And, you know, so that is good. Two questions. One is Another one from Edward about La Cofradia owns the fields in Nayarit that should make their tequilas different in taste. But since they triple distill everything, there is no taste. So more of a commentary than a question there. But then he also has a question about what can anyone tell me about the Mezcal brand Sansecan? I have 2 bottles. And I know that it's a cooperative and they are based in Guerrero. I understand that an importer has finally made the headway to be able to bring the product into the US market. I don't know how much of an impact the coronavirus will have on when that will happen, but that is what I understand. It is excellent product. I don't know if either of you have had a chance to try any of it.
For years. I love it. And they've had brilliant label design since day one. Like always I'm serious label envy for that brand. Yeah, it's really cool.
And
they're sorry, yeah, just to plug Sansecan as much as possible. Sansecan, the brand is part of what we would call a nonprofit, a community association called Sansecan Timeni, which means onward together in their language. And the Mezcal piece is one element of their whole agave program, which is about retaining soil. They also have like artesania, handicraft programs that the women control and make all their own money. And they're a really, really incredible organization in one of the most conflict-ridden parts of Mexico, which is pretty much the reason why it's taken anyone so long to start to get it into the US. I worked with them probably 3 years ago on their solidarity bonds, which were, basically like pay now for Mezcal in a couple years so that they can, make it through the rainy season. And they're legit. They're the real deal. And they've had a really, really tough time in the last few years. So support them any way you can.
We have a question. Other than the looming presence of the tequila industry, why do you think raicilla and other ancestral spirits from Jalisco are so unfamiliar and underrepresented in the United States relative to Oaxacan mezcal? What historical or other forces account for this? That's a long response there.
I would say that what did they say, like, other than the dominance of tequila, or how was that phrased? I mean, that's a pretty big other than, I don't know the current numbers off the top of my head for mezcal, but a couple of years ago, certified mezcal went from 1% of the volume to 2% of the volume of tequila, right? And that was like 100% growth. And when you're in the shadow of tequila for this long, I think, and someone says, "Oh, I've got this liquor from Jalisco, but it's not tequila," I think there's a real barrier to entry in a lot of people's minds. And it's interesting because I usually do focus on kind of political economic factors and historical factors, but I'll also say I think there's an organoleptic thing. I mean, Jalisco has a wide diversity of agaves, and obviously it's a very big state, but I think Jaliscan mezcals for me tend to kind of have an acidity and a really citric nature that doesn't always do it for everybody. And I think, Oaxaca, with its even greater diversity, arguably the only place with more diversity than Jalisco and agaves, there's a Oaxacan mezcal for everybody. But I think it's possible that there's some people out there that couldn't get down with any Jalisco mezcal, maybe. I do think they can be maybe a little more challenging than some, right? they can be a little more challenging for. Yeah, no, I totally agree, man. I totally agree. But I think I think Jaliscan mezcals can be a little more challenging for some people's palates, I think.
I also will push it back and say on the importer brand side, there's a herd mentality that seems to happen of like, oh, well, Oaxacan mezcal is the only kind of mezcal, and therefore everybody continues to want to get mezcal from Oaxaca, and it just like becomes this building thing. And when I field questions from people who are interested in potentially starting a brand, or they want to get connected, it is always, who do you know in Oaxaca? And I'm like, there's so much other stuff out there. There's so many other regions. And for sheer sustainability purposes, we really need to start looking outside of Oaxaca and kind of lessen demand there and pick up expressions from other areas. So,
I think, so that question didn't come up on the thread here, so I'm not referring to it with reading it, but I think from what I heard you say, I think one of the important ways of looking at it is that anything requires work. When tequila wasn't a big thing, there were importers / marketers very famously tooting the horn for tequila, and they put their work into it, their blood, sweat, and tears to sell it and to engage and glad hand and taste and get drunk and have good time and advocate. So that's what has to happen. For my own self, I started in Oaxaca, not with any outside plan. That was 3 years before we launched, and when we launched, there were not a lot of mezcal brands, although all but one were from Oaxaca in the United States. The one that wasn't is Geraldo Berio, whatever. And it with flavors and stimulated by diversity. You can't deny all of Mexico because it's all there. It's really, it's a journey that you're cheating yourself of if you don't go there. Mm-hmm. But sure, if you're starting now in 2020, 2019, 2021, and you just want to like find something to flip, it's pretty normal that you would start in Oaxaca.
Yeah. That is true. And this was the follow-up from Michelle Wallace, who said to the anonymous attendee, it's also true that the people of Jalisco are not aware of the distillates they produce because of the U.S. market. But I'm not sure I fully understand the comment there. Let's see, do we have other questions from other folks, or any final words?
There's a question from Jonathan about 12 years ago he visited El Tuito, and there was in the process of developing a community distillery. One wall was up. Most of the processing was done outdoors. Did they ever get it off the ground? I don't know. So I actually don't know. I'm not familiar with it.
It didn't get off the ground. You've probably driven by it, Arik. It's been defunct for longer than I've been going out there. It's by the old slaughterhouse in El Tuito, like across the street, and you can look in and see an autoclave, and everything else has been stripped and stolen. But it's actually a pretty relevant story about why, entities trying to start things like denominations of origin have a really hard time getting people to trust them, because in the past, whenever the government or political parties or business interests, and all three were involved in that project, try to get something off the ground, basically the fighting never stops, the money disappears, and then everybody goes home really demoralized, And so that's one of the reasons why it can be a lot more attractive to say, like, hey, I'm gonna do my own thing, carajo, And the story is really, really sad. And when you talk to a lot of people, including Beto, who makes the Raicilla Costera, he gets enraged when he talks about it, just like how much time and money got wasted on that thing. And it's not for nothing that the people that came in from outside to organize this were like, let's get an autoclave in here and show these guys how it's done.
I haven't been there, but I have seen, it must have been around the same time. If it was 12 years ago when Sky drove by, and it was around that time, there must have been the same kind of program going through government funding and people trying to execute and capture for their own pocket. But in Mascota, I've been to two different what were intended to be community distilleries, and things that were partially built, partially pilfered, dead in the water, things that are that have never been completed. I think that has to do with in Mexico, very much the tide of momentum is very much connected to the government of the moment and how the cash flows. Yeah,
that's right.
Yep. And Michelle had a clarification to her earlier question that was really about that goes to why would the U.S. know more about Mexican spirits than the people of Mexico? And this was what we had talked a little bit about before. At this point, it seems like people in the U.S. might have a greater overall knowledge of Mexican distillates in the market than a lot of Mexicans in terms of how it's talked about and things that are available. And it's just an interesting cultural point between U.S. and Mexican markets.
I think we have to maybe apologize a little bit for some broad strokes as well. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, I think at the point of that conversation where we're talking about people in Mexico and what they're aware of, we might have been talking about that generation of Mexicans that have money, are in urban places, that are now between 65 and 35, 40, and they were culturally pressured into being successful internationally, and for them it's a source of pride and interest to drink scotches and other high value, high cost spirits from international perspective, as well as tequila. But there was almost a stigma attached in that community. But there are other communities and individuals throughout Mexico that totally know what they have, and so it's a big country.
Sure.
It's a huge country. So
right. And that is an important clarification, to be like, there are the large general markets in more urban areas versus, the people in these communities where the product is being made, and these regions and areas most definitely know the value of what they have.
And we're going to see in all of Mexico, we are seeing in all of Mexico, everyone in the young entrepreneur set, the young consumer set, the young adult consumer set, the touch points have changed. So, and by the time we're talking about 50 years from now, as they are retiring and whatnot, this conversation will be radically different for the whole country.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think when we talk about the U.S. sort of kicking off the mezcal boom, there's a part of that that's really true, but there was actually this kind of lucky confluence. Like the first time I came to Mexico City was probably 9 or 10 years ago, and there was already a huge youth scene around pulque, and I kind of got to see this moment of pulquerias being this thing where you would only see really sad old guys sitting there, to where all of a sudden school would get out and they would fill with high school and college kids. And in my mind, there's a resurgence of kind of cultural nationalism or real cultural pride in Mexico in my brief time in this, that is amazing. And I liken to, before my time in the US, in the 60s, when another group of young people were rediscovering Appalachian music and Delta blues and things like this, and you had this resurgence of a folk movement, right, that led to rock and roll, and that led to Americana and alt country and all these things that I think are fantastic. And I think at a very different time, we're seeing kind of a cultural youth movement that's really, in the same way, kind of saved some of these cultural legacies, which I think is fantastic. And I totally agree with what you guys are saying, because I tend to also speak in those broad strokes about the general consumer. But if, I don't know, Susan, what you would say, but if our people, the hardcore agave people in the US, what, maybe there's 10,000 of them, maybe. There's many more people than that who are related to a producer or live in the village of a producer.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is very
Yes.
true. And I know my own personal experience in traveling to Oaxaca first in 2003, and my whole entree into agave spirits was through the friends that I had made who were artists, who were younger or who were chefs. And again, it goes to that point of yours, Clayton, where it was like a younger kind of pride, resurgence, and cultural heritage, because at that time in the early, God, I hate to say aughts, but the early aughts, there was an interesting dynamic happening in Oaxaca where Mezcal had kind of been on the downslide, and part of that was from the boom and then the bust, but then also, just like seemed to be dwindling interest. And I fully appreciate Felix and Mezcaleria Quiche for having really built among the young art school students there such a tremendous interest in Mezcal and kind of reviving things and seeing it move through a younger generation that really embraced, what a lot of their older family members were seeing as, oh, that's the shit that my grandfather drinks, or like that's not really good. And it's just, and then in the pulquerias too in Mexico City, but just to see that kind of evolution. And I will say the experience here in the United States, when we started producing first our underground music art mezcal events, and then the official, and I'll say legal, the very legal Mexico in a bottle events. The younger Mexican Americans who were so excited to have in this country something that spoke to their cultural pride in history, and embracing it as well. So it's just it has been an interesting growth from that perspective. So any other thoughts on that? I have Michael
My
Hurley
thought on
has
that,
a comment.
Susan. Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. No, my thought on that is more just about you and Max and Mezcalistas and Mexico in a bottle, and just more of a thank you for being like, a lodestone, keeping the direction true and course for in such a positive way that needed to be customized for each individual by you. So I know that about you. If you all don't know that about Susan, know it now. She's amazing and wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you, Arik, for the very, can't make me cry on my birthday. That is not allowed with kind words. And then Michael Hurley had a comment about our, that discussion over youth, because, what he's seen is that Bacanora was rarely consumed by youth in Hermosillo, and that it had been more of the drink among abuelos and borrachos. But yeah,
there's probably a moment in time that you would say that about every like local spirit throughout Mexico. It all goes through its cycles. Bacanora, that's another call, Susan, because we have to talk about the 77 years of prohibition and all the socioeconomic and cultural stifling that, it's a mess, the history.
Yeah.
You're coming out of it.
Yeah.
And I think it also, I think it also kind of goes back to that point about regionalism and the borders not really mattering. I mean, northern Mexico to me is another country, and I mean, when I'm there, I feel, closer to Texas culturally than to Mexico City, with no disrespect recommended it to anybody. People in Mexico City say that in a very ugly way, but and, you know, I love the Bacanora region. I love what I've got to learn about Sotol, but I think it stands to reason that sort of like youth culture and trends would be, you know, very different. They are, you know, than they are here or than they are in the south of Mexico.
Yeah. All right, I think
Ed asked me a question about new stuff from my import list. We have ideas, we have some products, we have some label approval, but it's not really the time where we're bringing in new things, unfortunately. But I'll let you all know for sure.
Why?
Yeah. Yeah. Next week we're going to be talking to Josh Verser with El Rey Zapoteco on the experience of launching a brand into the market just as a pandemic hits. And this is a, you know, it's a well-respected brand in Oaxaca. It's got a name behind it. And here we are. Nope, here we are trying to figure out how you do that. So say everybody should tune in next week because I'm sure it's going to be an interesting talk. But
hey,
sorry,
Susie, can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I would say, you know, not to be a copycat, but echo everything Arik said about you all and Mexico in a Bottle. And you find a way to be supportive of everybody and stay friends with everybody. And I know that's not easy. And, you know, kind of tying that to the way I've been thinking about all this, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the DOs. I would encourage everybody to read Sarah Bowen's book. I told you I was going to get a prop.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's backwards, but this is a very, very thoughtful work on the pros and cons of DOs in Mexico. But you know, it has always got me thinking a lot about, are DOs just vehicles for certain people to get rich, or do they in fact preserve these traditional cultures and bring economic benefit to their producers? And to the extent to which they're negligent on the latter part of that, it's really fallen to people like you all, Mezcalistas, you all, Arik, you know, other friends of ours that are importers, distributors, brands with heart, with ethics. You know, hopefully I'm doing my small part. That I think that this is I think a positive thing about our culture as gringos is that we do kind of have a do-it-yourself ethic. And you know, I'm not someone that thinks that like the market or commerce solves all problems, but I do think that in this scene or this community or this industry that we're all a part of in some way, folks like both of you guys and many others are doing a really good job of filling those gaps where the DOs are falling down, and that we can't necessarily expect these institutions to meet those goals, but that we can support, you know, amongst ourselves, those of us who are trying to do that.
Thank you. Yeah, we try. Luckily, we love it. So, all right. Well, I think that's it. The queue is quiet. I greatly appreciate everybody participating in this talk. As always, it is fascinating with both of you, and to have you together was a real treat, because we've had the individuals, but you know, never together. So thank you all. And I will be sending the link out as soon as it becomes, you know, recorded and live. So look for that for the next couple of days in your inbox. And we will be talking again. All right. Everybody have a good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.